Alright, so I'm going to get started. My name's Andrew Maurer. I work with the Jumby Bay Hawksbill project. I've been working with them since 2015, and I'm a PhD student at North Carolina State University, and I'm here this year in Antigua on a Fulbright Fellowship. And so part of that fellowship, part of what I've been doing is organizing seminars here at the museum, one a month, except for last month's got canceled. But so far, other people have been giving the talks, so today I'm going to bite the bullet and give a talk myself. So I'll be talking about Sargassum in the Caribbean. So I work with the Jumby Bay Hawksbill project, so my expertise is in the effects on sea turtles, but we'll start with its causes, then get to its impacts on sea turtles, and then I hope to sort of open it up to the room for the management approaches. I have a few slides and we'll say a few things, but maybe some of the people in the audience have ideas that I haven't even considered for the management part.
What beach is that? This slide?
That's Pasture Bay at Jumby Bay, looking north.
I can see.
So I'll just start with a few images. So starting in about 2011, we just had huge amounts of sargassum showing up on our windward coast throughout the Caribbean. So these images come from 2011 to current day, but this is Tobago. This is in Barbados. This is a pilot whale. So when you have so much sargassum coming in, animals can get stuck and drown. So this is a pilot whale that we think drowned. This is Barbados again. This is here in Antigua. This is from this year. This is Rendezvous, a before and after. So this is before on the left. So my friend Vic, we shot this with a drone, and on the right is after a big raft came through. So you can see, we think about what we can see on the beach, but you can see how far its effects go out into the bay, into Rendezvous Bay. And then again, this is where we started. This is at Jumby Bay, where I studied the nesting hawksbill population. So that was just a little primer to lead us into this talk. So I'm going to talk about what's causing the sargassum influx. Not research that I've done, but just I've read the research of other people's, so I'll review that. And then I'll talk about some research that I've done with the Jumby Bay Hawksbill project, looking at how incubating sea turtles' nests might be affected if sargassum washes on top of it, and then also how females emerging to nest. So when they arrive at our coasts and are looking for a spot to nest, how that process is affected. And then we'll finish with the question, how can we deal with sargassum moving forward? So what management approaches can we take? And I think that's sort of the big question as we look into the future right now. So let's start at the top. What's causing the sargassum influx, this invasion? So if you look at this map, this is a map, includes the Caribbean here, and you can see these red arrows show the direction that sargassum travels. And so historically, before 2011, we always had sargassum on the high tide line, where high tide left a little rack line, but never in the quantities that we have now. So historically, when we had a little bit, it originated here in the northwest Gulf of Mexico. And if you follow the arrows, some of it ended up in the coasts, on our coast, and then it ended up in the Sargasso Sea, where regional currents, they make a circular gyre that amasses huge quantities of sargassum. But now, if you focus lower on this map, what we have is a new pattern. We have huge amounts that we've never, unprecedented amounts, coming up from the south. So what ends up in the Caribbean, most of it originates off of Brazil. And it's coming from a region called the North Equatorial Recirculation Region. So if you follow these arrows again, it's a big circular, or more like an oval current that circulates here between Brazil all the way to Western Africa. And so what we're seeing now comes up again from Brazil, from that recirculation region. And the question is why? Yeah?
Was there always sargassum in there?
That's a good question. Because what we're seeing now is a new type of Sargassum. So we think maybe it was always there, but because it wasn't causing issues and no one was really researching it, it was largely undetected. Because what we have two species that dominate the Atlantic, two species of Sargassum. So Sargassum is a macroalgae. It grows, it starts its growth on the ocean floor, and then it detaches, and then it can grow and reproduce while free floating. And so things like increased carbon dioxide in the water, warmer temperatures, those are going to help growing conditions. So it is proliferating, but why now? So we have two species in the Atlantic, Sargassum natans and Sargassum fluitans. So these two on the left are what we've always seen before 2011. It's these two types. So you can think of these as subspecies, so different types of Sargassum within the same species. So our Sargassum natans 1 and our Sargassum fluitans 3. But what we're seeing starting in 2011 is this new type on the right that we never really saw before. And so it might have always, this new type might have always been down there by Brazil, but we didn't really know about it because it wasn't showing up in the Caribbean. So if you look at this, start by looking at this graph here, and you can look at 92 through 2013, 2011, and then 2014. There's this huge spike. This is Sargassum density. There's this huge spike in 2014. And if you look at the Sargasso Sea, there's no real pattern, no real change. And so that's really good evidence that, again, what's happening is not coming from the Sargasso Sea, it's coming from the south. And if we look, again, we have these three types, natans 1, fluitans 3, and natans 8. And those are represented here. So the darkest one is that new type. And you can see it's most abundant coming up from Brazil. And so that's what's dominating the current invasion. But if you look at the Sargasso Sea, it's the old types are dominant, the types that we knew about before. So it's this new type of Sargassum that's coming up and being brought up by currents. So we know, using satellite tracking studies, we know more about where it's coming from and that it's a new type, but it's still kind of up in the air, why is this happening? So people are studying a number of factors that might be causing it, but I don't think there's still a clear cause and effect. I think there's a lot of interacting factors that make it difficult to really put your finger on. But in that north equatorial recirculation region, there's these big consolidation regions where a lot of the Sargassum collects. And it just so happens that there's major rivers next to both of these recirculation regions. So we have the Amazon flows out here, Brazil, and then the Congo flows out here in West Africa. And so people think that that might be related to what's going on. So here's a little map of where we're looking at, the station where this was measured. This is in the Amazon River. These are nitrates and phosphates through time. And so nitrogen and phosphorus. And so those are going to help growing conditions. So you can see through time, we've had an increase in nitrogen and nitrates and an increase in phosphates. And that would definitely help growing conditions for a macroalgae. But I will say, this is a gradual increase if you use the trend line. So why this, in 2011, why, it's like we went over a cliff in 2011. Why such a sudden jump? So that's why I say I don't know if there's clear cause and effect, but the increase in nitrates and phosphates, because we're converting forests to farms and we're changing the land cover and the watersheds that flow into those rivers, that might relate to what's happening.
Where is that taken from?
So that's taken a little inland up the Amazon in Brazil at a station. And from that same station, this is just nitrates now. You can see, so nitrate flux anomaly, so like a big spike in nitrate. So maybe it's these big pulses of nitrates that are affecting this, because these we haven't really seen before. These are really high and they started about in 2010. So that matches our trend. And then also ocean currents. So there's a paper that just came out and I think they've done the best job fitting their predictions to the actual data. So they just look at ocean currents and built a model to predict if we're going to have a lot of Sargassum. And so the blue, these are just computer predictions in the blue and green they were able to predict what actually happened pretty well, which is shown in black. So it's not only the nitrates and the phosphates, and then and global warming, but these ocean currents. So there's a mix of factors. So it's hard to put your finger on exactly what's happening. It's probably some interaction of all these, but we're getting a better grasp of what's happening. So if we can predict this well, what's happening based on ocean currents, maybe we can predict better what's going to happen if we monitor the currents and changes in currents on a year-to-year basis. So that was my attempt to answer what is causing the Sargassum influx. And now I'll move on to its effects on sea turtles. So all this research comes from the Jumby Bay Hawksbill project. There's a Hawksbill beach, a high-density Hawksbill beach, and we have data dating back 32 years. So it's a great place to answer these questions, to approach these questions, because we also have Sargassum there. So we can relate what's happening to the turtles to how much Sargassum is present. But first, let's see how incubating sea turtle nests might be affected. And so this is important because the incubation environment is really important to what sex ratio the clutch has, so the sex ratio of the clutch, and also how many turtles hatch out of the clutch, so the hatching success.
Say that in ordinary English.
So the incubation environment, the nest, yeah, the temperatures in the nest and the gas exchange in the nest affect how many turtles actually make it out of the nest, and affect how many boys and girls, the sex ratio of the clutch. Point it out as we move along. So sea turtles have temperature-dependent sex determination. So here on the x-axis we have temperature, and then on the y-axis we have percentage female. And so these are actual nests that some researchers studied, and they incubated eggs at a set temperature and then looked at the resulting sex ratio of the clutch. And you can describe that relationship between temperature and sex ratio. So you can see at warmer temperatures we have more females, and at colder temperatures we have more males. And then there's that temperature that creates a 50-50 sex ratio we call the pivotal temperature. So this is how temperature-dependent sex determination works. So we think that if Sargassum covers a nest, it might affect the incubation temperature and thus affect how many males and females are created. And that's really important because with global warming, we're seeing more and more females. And so it's a really important issue for sea turtle conservation. And so if Sargassum is affecting this process, we want to know what's happening. And the way we do this is with temperature data loggers. It's about the size of a thick marker. And looks like that, and so we put them in with incubating sea turtle eggs. So as a sea turtle is laying its eggs, we stick one of the data loggers in with the eggs, and it logs temperature every 5 minutes. Then the eggs incubate for about 2 months, they hatch, and then we dig out the logger, and we hook it up to a computer, like so, and download the data. And so what we did was we put one of these data loggers under 3 treatments. So we did this 10 times. We did this group of replicates 10 times. So we buried one under a high Sargassum treatment, we buried one under a low Sargassum treatment, and we buried one under no Sargassum, so the control. And this is what it looks like in practice out in the field. We have no Sargassum, medium or low Sargassum, and then a high amount of Sargassum. So we did that for 5 days at a time and had the data loggers logging temperature. And what we saw was, so we analyzed this, it's called an ANOVA, but the important thing here is that we saw an interaction between treatment and season. So we did these 10 replicates throughout the year, and this was in 2015. And so we did some of them in the summer, and some of you might remember in 2015 we had record drought. And then we did some of them in October and November when we had more rain showing up. And so we didn't plan this, but we ended up with a wet season and a dry season. And so we found that it really depends on what season the probes were buried to see how temperature was affected. And so this is what it looks like. We had up on the top in the wet season in October and November, this increasing sargassum treatments actually led to a warming effect. So we would expect the result for the nests, we would expect more females. And when it was dry, the increasing sargassum led to a cooling effect. So this was really interesting. We didn't, we weren't expecting to find this. And so it suggests that the results could be quite variable. So it depends on moisture conditions. And I think this kind of makes intuitive sense. It's logical because wet conditions would aid decomposition, which would generate heat. And so maybe that's an explanation for this. Whereas the dry sargassum sort of dries out and just becomes this crumbly mess, and that might just be a shading effect, so that might cool the nest.
Wet and warm?
Wet led to, in the wet season, we had a warming effect with more sargassum, and in the dry season, we had a cooling effect. Yeah, so it was a little more complicated than we just hypothesized that it would cool it. Yeah?
Did you use the atmospheric temperature at all in that analysis? The temperature of the air change?
Well, we centered every replicate, so we started, the control was set to 0, so that controlled for that. So we're just looking at the difference from control. And so, if we look at these yeah?
When you're taking the holes, did you account for, how much the sea turtle actually compacts the sand above the base versus make sure you have a compact in the sand above the base levels? And could that then also not make that impact?
Yeah, a sea turtle might compact the sand more. That's a good point. So we didn't account for that. But the 25 centimeters depth is probably a little bit deeper than the top of the sea turtle nest. And so hopefully these results are still useful. And so if we look at so for instance here we had a change from the control of 0.36 degrees. And so if we look at what that means for the sex ratio of the clutch, 0.36 degrees, if we look at this x-axis, 0.4 degrees, it can be a significant change in sex ratio. And so we think, if you think of those pictures earlier in this talk, where you have a huge amount of sargassum on the beach, if sea turtle nests get covered, it will definitely have effects on the sex ratios. And so the more basic hypothesis, the more intuitive hypothesis was that sargassum is acting as a barrier to nesting females. It's blocking off the nesting beaches. So we wanted to answer that question quantitatively as well. And so, again, it's a basic hypothesis. We see things like this, where this is a hawksbill turtle trying to exit through sargassum, and it's really difficult. And then recently this year, Liz, who's in the audience, she took this video of a hawksbill. So this is sped up 3 times, but she somehow made it through that to come nest. But then you'll see it's quite difficult to leave.
Where is that?
That's at Jumby Bay. Yeah, so sorry it's a little sad. Sorry if that's dampening the mood. Yeah.
As a result of this, you have that incidence of finding egg.
Not at Jumby Bay. In Barbados, they have seen that, but juveniles that are swimming and get trapped in it, not adults so far. And people see the hatchlings sometimes dead, but we haven't seen that at Jumby Bay either, thankfully.
Probably because the weed came in from the giants.
Yeah. But I think hopefully the adults are strong enough that they can swim through or around it. But yeah, it would be trouble if a big raft came in. Yeah, so she did make it out, but the point here is it's a mess. It's definitely acting as barrier, but can we say that statistically? And so this is Jumby Bay, and this is the nesting beach. So that's Pasture Bay there, where all our turtles nest for the most part. And it's important for this analysis to imagine, so we have our beach is set up into zones. So imagine you're doing a turtle patrol and you walk along the beach. And so you walk 10 meters and that's zone 1. And then you walk another 10 meters and you've gone through zone 2. So our beach is in zones like that. We break it up perpendicular to the shoreline. So we have 36 zones on the beach. And so here's the end of zone 11. So that stake denotes the start of zone 12. So this dotted red line is the break between zone 11 and zone 12. And so here's a crawl in zone 11. So we would count that as a crawl in zone 11. And so what we also did in 2015, we counted crawls in all of those zones, and we also estimated the Sargassum abundance in each of those zones. So what we did is we created kind of like an index of abundance, which just resulted in a number 0 through 7, and was based on the height, the width of this pile that washed up, and then if there was any floating offshore. So how that worked was, if there was no Sargassum, our index was 0. And then as you increase in height or width, you'd add 1, and then if you had a little bit floating in the water, it would be a 1, and if there was a lot, it would be 2. So it's pretty rough and coarse estimate, but we did this during the whole nesting season, and so it gives us a nice way to see if crawls are affected. So again, that index was 0 through 7. And we wanted to look at this question 2 ways. So the first way is we looked just at 2015. There was a lot of Sargassum on the beach, and we wanted to ask if you're in a zone and there's a lot of Sargassum and then it washes away, is a sea turtle is the sea turtle going to respond to that? Will it come back after it washes out? So within the 2015 nesting season, are sea turtles responding? Is Sargassum affecting nesting? Is it impeding crawls? But because so we had 445 crawls in our sampling period that year in 2015, and we had 36 beach zones, but we combined them into 9. So we combined 4 zones at a time. And then we broke the season into sampling periods, and this is important because we needed to control, there's a peak in nesting in the middle of the sampling period. So if we didn't account for that, we wouldn't be able to observe the effect of Sargassum. So we needed to control for that. So we broke it up into sampling periods so we could include that in our multiple regression. And we think that there's differences by zone as well. Certain zones of the beach are just naturally more favored by turtles. So we wanted to control for that. Otherwise, we might not be able to observe the effect of Sargassum. So yeah, we did a multiple regression with these 3 variables. So we controlled for beach zone because there's more nesting down here, and that's the way this nesting beach works. So we wanted to control for that. And then we also, because of that peak, again, this is June, and then moving through to November, there's a peak around August, late July, August, and we needed to control for that. So we included an effect, and when you have a shape like that, it's a quadratic effect, it's not linear. So we included a quadratic term for period. But the point is that after controlling for those factors, Sargassum did impede, it blocked nesting. And so we had a negative coefficient. And so that means as our Sargassum index increased in each zone, the crawls decreased. So Sargassum is blocking nesting. And then we compared different years. So that was just 2015, but we could look back at 2008 to 2010 when there was no Sargassum or very little on the beach. And then 2016, there wasn't very much Sargassum at all. So we wanted to look at this another way and compare our 2015 data to both that historical data and then 2016 when there was no Sargassum. And so we did this. So again, our nesting beach is broken up into 36 zones. So each of these dots is one zone. And so this dotted line is 0. And so if you're below, our change in nesting, if you're below that, your nesting dropped. And if you're above it, your nesting increased. And so you can see for each zones with a higher amount of sargassum, the nesting dropped, and zones with less sargassum, it actually increased. So what that's telling us is that there's a displacement. So that can compensate. So we have a drop in nesting where there's high sargassum, but they're able to move to zones where there's less sargassum. And so that is somewhat a luxury of the shape of our nesting beach. So sargassum is highest here, and so, but we don't have very much here because of this point. And so sea turtles, what that data shows us is that sea turtles are coming here, not being able to nest, and they're displaced to where they can nest. And then we looked at a response. So would the turtles, in 2016 when the sargassum went away, would the turtles come back to the same zones where they like to nest? And they did. So in 2015, zones that had really high sargassum, crawls returned. So there was a positive change in crawls in 2016. So if we look at that side by side, in 2015 crawls decreased, but then when the sargassum disappeared, in 2016 crawls increased. And so what this is sort of a positive result. It's encouraging because it tells us the turtles can respond to it. They understand what's going on, and they can move around it and make decisions to avoid it. They're not just going to swim into it repeatedly, or we hope. The data suggests they're not just going to swim into it and be unsuccessful. They're displaced. They're going to find places where they can nest, hopefully. As long as, you know, like our nesting beach, we have some spots with bare sand. As long as those spots exist, the turtles will hopefully find them. Some other effects some other impacts of the sargassum influx on sea turtles that we didn't study were hatchlings. And so hatchlings, you know, if a sea turtle comes and lays its nest and leaves, that nest is incubating for 2 months. So that's plenty of time for a big mass of sargassum to come in, which definitely creates issues for hatchlings if they're trapped under it or if they have to crawl through it. So that's definitely a potential impact. And then the offshore, the significance of more sargassum floating out in the ocean. So far everything that I've said is negative, but my hypothesis would be that this has a positive effect on sea turtles. So we assume younger sea turtles go out and live underneath seaweed mats, and so if there are more of them providing more shelter and habitat, that might increase survival of younger sea turtles, so that might actually be a positive effect. So for these 3 questions, if we go over those before we move into management. So what is causing the sargassum influx? Well, it's some interacting effects between ocean currents, human activity, so increased runoff of the nitrates and phosphates because we're changing the land cover around those important rivers. So ocean currents, human activity, and then global change is likely involved as we have warmer waters and more CO2 in our waters, so plants like that to grow. And algae, I should say, likes that for growing conditions. How are sea turtle nests affected? Well, our data suggested it depends on if the sargassum is wet or dry, which was interesting, and so it could be quite variable. So it's something to continue to monitor at different nesting beaches. And then how are females emerging affected? We think that it impedes them and displaces the nesting, and hopefully there's somewhere where they can be displaced too, is a key part of that. And now the question, the big question, how can we deal with sargassum moving forward? And so again, if you have an idea or if you have anything to say about this, just speak up at any time or I'll open it up at the end.
Before we get to that,
yeah.
is there a particular period of time in any of those years where sargassum is more prevalent than less prevalent, like a season end?
Yes. So, and they could the study that I talked about that could predict it with currents. So 2011 was a big year. 2015 was a big year, then it sort of receded in 2016. I know that this is the worst year on record.
But like between, say, May and August, between
Oh, okay.
July and...
Like within the calendar
yeah,
year?
Yeah.
Yeah, it peaks in August,
Okay.
and then I think it recedes in the, no?
Peaks in June.
In June?
That is
In the summer.
it's a Jumby.
In the summer, I think it's,
Summer, yeah.
it's a summer seasonal thing, and it recedes a little bit
Because of
in the
heat.
winter
What they
because of
found
currents
with
and
those,
temperatures.
the sensors that were done, is that it starts growing or starts moving January, February, gets to us by about March, and then increases, and then starts dying by August.
Yes, it's kind of supporting what you guys said. The University of South Florida has been looking at the loop, current loop between the Electoral Park. And that's just saying it's breaking down in strength between January and March of the year. And that's what's pulsing towards the Caribbean, gain strength. So basically that pulse, during that time it breaks on, that's probably when once that pulse regains strength, it pulls the sea back in. So it basically time to travel between that zone and the Caribbean. Once that loop is formed up, it can stop. So
Yeah, that's that study where they built models pretty much just around the currents, and that's a really powerful predictor of what we're going to have. And there are like yearly changes and not just seasonal changes that affect the pattern.
So, sorry, when does the current start up again?
So what this found so far is breaking down between January and March, April. But
Right.
again, because it's so new, they still haven't, concluded and said, all right, every year it's gonna reform by April or reform by April. It's still a little bit too bare.
So being able to predict it is a huge tool, but to some degree it seems like a new reality for the Caribbean. And so whether it's a lot or a little bit on any given year, that's really useful to know, but we're going to have to be dealing with it. And so we need to come up with management approaches. And so it might be coming, and a lot of it depends on how much is coming in, so it might look like this. Greg took this photo, snagged it off Facebook, where it's just streaks of it coming in that slowly build up, or it might look like this, where it's an absolutely massive amount
Amazing.
that comes in at one time. So this is drone footage shot of Jabberwock, I believe just a couple months ago.
Yeah.
It's a couple minutes, but I think it's worth watching the whole thing.
Yeah, I'm sure.
It's just getting started.
Andrew. West Coast.
They're, yes, they're seeing sargassum that they never saw before. I think it's less studied, but I know they are seeing it. I don't know if it's to the degree that we have it, because you see those currents, they power through from Brazil up to us, and I think there's less of a current system there, but they do have a lot of it. So something like this, I mean, some of our management approaches, like raking it or trying to collect it off the beach, it's just, it's not even going to make a dent. And so the scale of the problem at any given time is a really big consideration.
Can I just add, you see that blob there right now? That's what those images were in the aerial shot of one of those blobs.
Okay. Oh, okay. Perspective. Gotcha. And so, why should we use our resources to manage sargassum? Well, I think these are pretty obvious, but it's an important starting point. It has serious effects on tourism, especially on our east coasts. Huge effects. And then there's human health considerations too. So some byproducts, as it decomposes, it produces hydrogen sulfide and ammonia, which can be, even at low exposures, if you have chronic low exposure, it can be harmful to human health. And then also heavy metals can accumulate as it breaks down, as more and more of it decomposes in one spot, including arsenic and cadmium. So these are things, I don't want to ring an alarm bell, but they're things people should be aware of if they're dealing with it or if they're close to it. And then obviously the ecological effects. So I named some on turtles, on sea turtles, but it's affecting the coastal ecosystem. If you remember that before and after of rendezvous, it's having very detrimental effects. Fish die-offs, because it sucks as it decomposes, all the oxygen leaves the water, and it blocks sunlight, so it's really harmful in the coastal zone. But what can we do? And so again, I don't have too much specific to say on any of these things, so I wonder if anyone else has anything that they want to say, but just broke it down into 4 basic steps or options. So we need to study it, obviously. We need more information about it to manage it properly. But then what can we actually do about it? Can we block or divert it? That might be one option that people are exploring. Can we remove it or do some combination of these two? And can we remove it and use it? Because removal will work a lot better if there's a demand for it once it's removed. And then I think a big one is we need to adapt to it probably. So even if we're removing and blocking it, we have to adapt our behavior or our land development even in some way. So we're getting better and better at understanding it because people are studying it. And so this is one example of satellite imagery showing its abundance in the region. And so we're getting better at predicting when it's coming in. We're getting better at monitoring how much is present at any given time. People are looking at effects on human health. So this is in St. Martin. It's tough to see, but they're looking at hydrogen sulfide and ammonia. So here's that blown up. They're looking at parts per million in hydrogen sulfide and ammonia in all these sampling locations. So coming up with systematic ways to look at those byproducts of it, especially around coastal communities or if workers have to go clean it up. And people are studying its ecological impacts. Again, I talked about sea turtles, but there's one study they called, when sargassum washes onto a coast, they called it a sargassum brown tide, where before you have a healthy ecosystem, in this case they have seagrass and coral ecosystem, then sargassum comes, it blocks sunlight. As it decomposes, the bacteria consume a lot of the oxygen, so that creates an oxygen deficit, and you're left with coral mortality, seagrass die-off. I know I've seen a lot of dead fish and other organisms, so it has a lot of different effects, and we're getting better at studying them. But again, I'll point to, in the coast, most of the effects seem negative, but it would do us well to study potential positive effects. So if we could do surveys underneath the mats, we might find higher abundances of organisms. There's things like the Sargasso fish that is endemic to Sargassum. It's only found with Sargassum seaweed. So there are certain species that might benefit as well. But the main thing for humans is it's coming up onto our coasts and creating a lot of issues. So can we block or divert it? So one strategy, the main strategy I'm thinking of blocking or diverting it is with booms. So it's a floating barrier, depending on, you have something floating on the surface blocking it, and then like a net hanging down below it to a certain depth. That's one potential option to keep it off beaches, but you still have it collecting out here, and so you'll want to do something with it once it's out here, but maybe you can remove it at that point.
Presumably it's rotting while it's sitting there.
Yeah, so you would want to remove it quickly.
It needs movement to keep it alive. Is that right?
Yeah, as it really collects like that in high densities, yeah, it starts to decompose. I think, yeah, when it fills up the water column like that.
So you mean when it's moving, it's not decomposing, it's only decomposing when it settles?
Yeah, it seems that way.
From what I've noticed flying over the middle of the sea, you see a really big mass in the center of the map, and sometimes you get that like decomposing of in the center. I have no idea how people.
Yeah, I wonder if it really clumps up into a dense mass, the center of it might become like carbon dioxide limited. Heat probably increases, so it probably dies and starts to decompose. I'm just guessing.
Has
Yeah, lack of light.
anybody done any studies on how it grows, how it blooms, and how how fast it grows.
Yes. And they've come up. I don't know them offhand, but they've measured the rates that it can grow given certain conditions.
Really?
Yeah.
My question is, that barrier, does it also impede sea life as well?
That's a great question. So I think, any of these options, it would be great if there are people assessing, the biological effects at the same time. It's definitely.
Second question. You just listed vaguely that chronic exposure to sargassum has negative health impacts, but what are those negative health impacts?
Yeah, so it's to the hydrogen sulfide, specifically is what I've read most about. I don't know that much about it. I've read some articles. I don't think it's well studied. Yeah?
I've read bloody noses or feeling nauseous, and they don't really know, as far as I have read, they don't really know what long-term exposure does, but just kind of small symptoms like that if after you've been in high concentrations. If it gets really high, it can be very dangerous, but low concentrations are.
Yeah. At really high, like she was saying, at really high concentrations, you're in trouble. And at that chronic low concentration, it's tough to say because thankfully, I don't know if it's happened to enough people where they're able to say what happens.
In the case of Capistrano, the south side of Narragansett, the town virtually got evacuated in 2015 because of the nauseous effect on people. And when the area between the reef and the shore was cleared out, which is about 300 metres, then that nauseous effect went away as the weed went away, and the town became unpopular.
In my area, lots of people have noticed terrible discoloration, tarnishing of grass, jewellery, whatever. But I'm also hearing, though, I haven't experienced it, but I'm also hearing electrical goods breaking down, TVs, stereos.
The metal parts.
I've heard that as well. Yeah.
I think there's a study, if I remember correctly, that's looking at trying to trap heavy metals that are coming from land clearance in Antigua. Trying to see if you can, because the theory that it's being basically getting nutrients from the Amazon River, from land clearance, from farming, from fertilizer. The theory then is that nutrients can then get trapped, or heavy metals can then get trapped, but when it comes here inside, it becomes released. There's only enough time has passed for it to actually get trapped with the right point. There's some theory that can also be potentially seen. That may emerge in the future.
Yeah, so whatever we talked about, nitrates and phosphates running off into those rivers, but if the sargassum is taking those in, it's probably taking in a lot of the other stuff that is running off as well.
Has there been any study done about the interaction of the dust from the Sahara area interacting with the runoff from the Northwestern Reserve?
I don't know for sure, not that I know.
I just read on Weather Underground, Category 6 column, and what I was talking about the water temperatures on the island are really taking over that. And
There's also some theory that the Sahara dust has enough iron to make iron go around the winter pattern of the world. It's been a theory that we switched around the algae and coral reefs, but it's very hard to measure the iron that under the surface versus what gets up to the winter. Because sargassum goes on the surface, there is some, I think there's a study looking at if they actually benefit from Sahara dust because iron is no longer the main part of it.
That's interesting. It's such a massive regional problem. There's so many inputs to consider. It's kind of overwhelming. So yeah, booms. Booms are one option to block or divert it. But maintenance on those. Again, I'm no expert on any of these. Just throwing some ideas on the screen. Maintenance has to be a real pain to keep those clean. And if you have a massive, like that big raft that came into Jabberwock, if that hit this boom, it would have issues containing it, and then eventually, you know, the water column would get completely stacked and it would probably shoot underneath the net. So,
You see it break up, there's no reef, I see it break up the east coast.
yeah,
Breaks it.
tough to anchor.
But also, even if you have a boom, it decomposes and the water underneath from the boom to the beach is polluted and it's just brown.
Yeah, so the boom, maybe these are best where you have like an offshore current that might divert it somewhere else. Or if you have an active removal program, so you keep your beach clean and you're not doing the removal on the beach, you're doing it at your boom. But it's one solution, it's one tool that people might use.
There's a recently suggested theory that if you direct it to one spot on the beach, so because the boom is actually cold, you may increase it. But if you kind of funnel it to one spot and focus your collection on that spot on the beach, you actually get less of overall footprint effect on the beach. The problem is you have to have booms that are strong enough to do the large mats, and the large mats are large. But if you can funnel it, it actually helps in terms of economic footprint that you have in terms of that. I just focus it on one area, and then you just focus on it cleaning it, so that one, and funnels it.
Is there anything that can take it out of the water yet?
Yeah.
I saw something using one loop and I saw it.
Jumby has a few harvesters that take it out of the water. Yeah. Work pretty well.
We flew gentlemen today, I won't say anything, but she's been looking at the currents coming in off the net and where the diversion is that goes around our field, and also studying the inland currents and how that's affecting where the weed is gathering in the bays or all the little units around Antigua. And he's seeing that it's a lot of times they tap into the base, but as the current comes in, it comes through the swirl and then ends up cutting down inside the base, and so you get these dead zones where the weed is decomposing, the water is really dark brown, it's just not getting out. But the interesting thing that we saw today was like 9 miles offshore where you can see that you turn back over towards Antigua and you see where it was diverting in the waves.
Because I've seen Maurer Bay is completely gone, whereas Javelot now is clear, half the beach is clear. And it's all
And you see a good example down right in front of Captain's, or Cecilia's Cafe and Black Restaurant. That whole way there is gone. There's no bother.
So, yeah, if you're blocking it or diverting it, you probably still need to come up with some strategy to remove it, depending on your situation. So, one strategy, big machinery on the beach. So this has a sweet, as a sea turtle biologist, this makes me cringe a little bit, thinking about if there's sea turtle eggs here, for instance. But with the sheer magnitude that's coming up, if it comes to the beach and you're a hotel with paying guests, you have to come up with ways to remove it usually. And then, yeah, our offshore harvesters, this is one example where you sort of have like a conveyor that is halfway dipped into the water and pulling it up and you collect it. And I think these are getting, you know, scaled up to a much bigger size. And so if you're harvesting huge amounts for biofuels, for instance, you probably want something way, way bigger than that. And it's interesting, I advertised this talk and someone emailed me. There's a guy in Anguilla and he has a colleague in Barbados, and they're putting together a plan for a big commercial harvesting operation based out of Barbados, and they want to, I don't know how many years of development this will take, but they want a big operation where they're harvesting kind of south of Barbados and turning huge amounts of it into biofuel and fertilizer. So that was just one, you know, a random email, but it's interesting. People in the region are coming up with ways. And again, the size of the issue, we need just massive operations to even have a dent. But this is, for instance, a basic step-by-step look at how using macroalgae for biofuels might work. It removes the need for added fertilizer. You don't need any cultivation techniques for sargassum. It cultivates itself out in the middle of the ocean, and so it removes the costs associated with these two steps. But then you do need to harvest it, and you need some sort of operation like that guy was talking about in Barbados to convert it. And so if somehow we can subsidize like a biofuel market and make it cheap enough and get demand high enough, maybe that is one source of hope for dealing with this issue. But again, I'm a little skeptical that anyone can scale up to the size of the issue. And to keep it profitable, you probably want to go where there's the most sargassum to collect. But to protect our beaches, you probably want to target certain spots that might be a different location altogether. So again, it's just a complex issue. And so I'll just finish by saying, I think one thing that any of these strategies should incorporate, and definitely like land use planners and developers, is if this is the new norm for the Caribbean, we need to find ways to adapt as well. So the green here is our land masses, and we have arrows show regional currents at some given time, and you can see it's a strong east to west pattern. So I think our windward beaches are going to be impacted by this for a long time. And so I'll just throw out new windward hotel development might think twice about this issue or strongly about this issue before they develop. That might be one way we're adapting to this issue, or personal homeowners. But I think if this is the new norm, people need to start adapting to it, because blocking and removing it, there are options, and maybe we can come up with good ways to do it. But there's a bottom line to all those. It's going to be costly, a lot of resources and man hours. So just coming up with ways to adapt to it is definitely important as well.
Just a quick question for my partners here. On the beaches where it's been mechanically removed, does it come back just as quickly, or if it's been left in the sea, does it continue to grow and growing out further or more? So is it basically better to mechanically remove it when it lands on the beach, or to leave it and let it decay and get on the floor after doing that? Has anybody done anything to suggest that quickly improves how much it is?
Did you have a thought, Greg?
Well, from what I see coming out of I think Mother Nature there, there's obviously an innovation developed in residents maybe, they want to go out and get the sea and eventually you might get 3 or 4 periods where it's really heavy.
I think it's a question of time versus and resources.
Well, luckily it comes in the summer, our summer.
Yeah.
Tourists are affected. However, I worry about the mechanical taking it off the beaches because the amount of sand that's taken up with it. If it's taken off and put in wherever, we don't recoup the sand. There's some talk about erosion. People was talking about erosion at Barbuda.
Yeah, definitely where it stacks up, it changes the hydrology of any bay, where the wave action is pushed farther out, so it's ripping sand out further behind where the sargassum is sitting. And then yeah, if you're removing it, especially that big machinery it's taking it, it adds up the amount of sand that's taken off if you're continually removing it.
It's doing that, but that's a temporary thing. Just like hurricanes create a temporary removal of sand on the beach, and come back 4 weeks later and the beach bone is getting back over. And that's exactly what happens. You got undermined and then it's just
I think there's a natural process there of erosion and accretion. Sand comes back, but if you add removal on the coastline and sand compaction underneath, heavy lifters, it's might add a different dynamic.
So, kind of responding to a couple points. In terms of leaving it at the beach, sargassum becomes a big problem once it hits the coastline. That's where it starts to pile, that's where it starts to die. It doesn't necessarily continue to grow once it's caught along the shore. So it's leaving it there, it will decay and cause like lack of oxygen, etc. fish growth. And it is more sargassum coming, like if it's early in the season, like it's the first of the yard, you might be going to have added crop. So there's some thoughts about prioritizing, you kind of have to prioritize some people, others depending on the scale factor they use to prioritize each maybe a hotel may say this beach they're going to prioritize and focus on heavy removal, and that beach, like, I think St. James focus heavy removal on their most eastward beach and decided that they don't focus as heavy. One of the biggest problems has been what do you do with sargassum once you remove it. So the more and more we looked into it, the more we found that there are many suggestions for removing it. The Iraq Division actually released a policy in terms of recommended procedures in how we go about dealing with different animals. And the suggestions about going back to the old school days and using horse-drawn cats because they have less impact on the beaches for small amounts. Using manual raking, if you're going to use heavy equipment, you use tires, softly inflated tires and not trap the same thing. You work with different agencies that know whether you're nesting beaches, if you're using it or water. But then once you take it off the beach, the question becomes where do you put it? Because it's biological material. Once it's been removed, it's definitely going to be. And it's definitely going to provide it. It's definitely going to salt content. It definitely has a lot of sand. There is some thought of looking into actually burying it back into sand dunes at the back of the beach with the idea that it actually nourishes the beach over time. Especially so you're not burying it to the front of the beach, but you know, like it's second dune along the beach, you can then bury the sargassum in that area, which is actually positive for the beach on overall. But can you get enough space to bury the amount of sargassum that we've seen is again one of the big questions. So the quantities that we've seen, there are some solutions to it. Let's just deal with our quantity. There's no one fix it for all. That is important.
I've been using it as a mulch for years, and I've seen nothing detrimental in the garden about it. It does really grow. It keeps the moisture in. People say that it may have salt content, but so far I've seen nothing that has destroyed or hurt the plants. And I've heard that some farmers are using it to surround their fields to stop the snails from going into the field because they won't travel over the roughness in the soil.
If you're using it as a fertilizer or mulch, and it does have heavy metals in it, is there any research done in like are the plants that you're eating taking any of those heavy metals from the sargassum area? But I don't know if that has been studied.
Mine are on flowering plants where there's not necessarily
There are a couple other hands. Yeah.
I was reading recently that in the United States, I think they've actually banned harvesting of the seed out before it gets in because of the unknown effects it has on the other sea life and these sort of things. And as a result, these companies are now going to carry a set of operation in order to do what they are not going to do in the US. But is that a situation where they have some sort of studies done that would have determined the effects that will be happening on the sea life?
Well, yeah, I think it's you know, it's loaded full of life. Everything from small organisms to that fish that only lives in sargassum to the young sea turtles. So there's a lot of concerns associated with its offshore harvest. So that I assume that it's related to that. Yeah. Interesting.
Has it been studied enough to know if it doesn't hit land, where it ends up? Where does it go? Does it go?
Miami Beach.
It's gonna have to hit land. go and join the Sargassum Sea?
Yeah, it probably just depends on what the currents are like at that time. Hopefully, as much of it ends up in the Sargassum Sea as possible and not on these coasts.
But it's a different type. You get it, then you get the different type. You get the mixing of the species.
Yeah, but yeah, I think most of it ends up, because I know we hear a lot of reports from our region, but they have huge amounts in Mexico, other parts in Central America. We're starting to get more and more in Florida. Yeah, so that wraps up my talk. If we can continue the discussion a little bit, that'd be great.
One question that I don't think I got an answer for.
Okay.
On Pasture Bay, where you know all of the are there any removal taking place from our beach, or are you leaving it there?
It's being removed in parts, yeah, in sections. But there are sections of the beach where it's tough to remove it from, and so it stays there and really clogs up the water up there.
Remove on request of the
That is above. It's handled above me.
What was the question?
If it's done at the request of landowners.
To some extent, too, they will naturally end up in the areas you will be every day. The jokes section will come online and it's like all around.
After a pretty prolonged period of time. It's a quite prolonged period of time.
Yeah, because
Yeah, but like on a commercial beach or anything.
yeah.
You just can't leave it that long.
Yeah. Hopefully people will continue to discuss this a little bit, but I'll turn off the screen and wrap up my talk. Just thank you for coming, eat up the food outside. And yeah, thanks again.
Thank you. And do you know what your next subject is?
Ask Julio.
Okay.
Yeah, we're scheduling the next seminar, I think mid-August, potentially August 18th if we can confirm the date. It'll be on fisheries management, coral health, and Julio can tell you more. We just have the date. Well, you didn't tell me that. Where was this?
It was 14 miles north of